Welcome to this online conference on a different crisis, and we need different policies. This conference should take place in Berlin, but for obvious reasons, now we are going online, and we are pleased to join forces with FEPS, Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and also DGB and I am key as all the organizations behind this. And we are extremely pleased and in fact proud to count on these high-level speakers. Nadia CALVIño, Deputy Prime Minister of the Government of Spain, also the Minister of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation, and I am key. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Laureate and Professor of Economics in Columbia University. And finally, Paolo GENTLONI, European Commissioner for Economic Affairs. So welcome for all of you, and many thanks for taking your time to join us in such an important moment, in fact, for European history. We know that big decisions are about to be taken. There is high expectation on the content, on the direction, on the scope, on the ambition of these decisions. And that's why this panel can also be so important. Let me tell you that we have more than 400 people who subscribe, but in fact, it's better to assume they are much more. And we should not be surprised, because the interest about the issue we are discussing today is extremely high right now. We will like to give some minutes of interaction with this audience, and that's why our FEPS Director of Research, David Rinaldi, will now just introduce in 1 minute the technicalities to make this happen. So David, I pass you the floor.
Thank you, dear President. Thanks everybody for joining today's Progressive Economic Policy online conference. As the President mentioned, we were supposed to host a physical gathering in Berlin in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the German Trade Union Confederation, and the Macroeconomic Policy Institute of the Hans-Böckler-Stiftung for what we called the Day of Progressive Economic Policy. Unfortunately, that cannot materialize in person, but we will organize these two online events, also in collaboration with the Madrid-based Pablo Iglesias Foundation. It does not really matter whether you are following the conversation via Zoom or via Facebook Live. You can pose your questions to our distinguished speakers either via the Q&A function that you find on Zoom or as a comment to the Facebook Live. I will personally go through the questions, and I will pick a couple of them, the good, smart, and maybe the difficult ones, that I will present to our speakers on behalf of the audience. As you can understand, we won't have a lot of time for interaction, but you can contribute to the discussion also via Facebook and Twitter with the hashtag ProgressiveEcon or COVID-19. And if you hear something that you agree with, don't hesitate to share. Another way to continue interacting with European Progressive is another way to continue interacting with European Progressive is to remain with us tomorrow on the 27th. Again at 5 p.m. we will host the second Progressive Economic Policy online conference to focus on the agenda for the incoming EU presidency and what we call the EU recovery budget. We will host EU Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, the Czech Deputy Minister for Europe Aleš Čemelar, and the Chief Economist of the German Federal Ministry of Finance, Jakobo von Weizsäcker. Another way actually to remain in touch with the European progressives on this topic is to follow the upcoming blog that the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FEPS and other partner will maintain during the length of the German presidency to talk about European economic policy in German and in English. And there are strategic reasons to use both languages. Now, before giving back the floor to President Maria João Rodrigues, I will have to ask all our speakers to offer their best smile to the camera so that we can take a family picture and everybody can take a screenshot for our social. So a big smile for progressive economic policy. And dear President, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David. So we need to assume that we are in Berlin and talking to all over Europe. And we need to assume that we are speaking to an audience which is combined a bit of everything. We need to have advisors, policymakers, members of the European Parliament, officials working in the European Commission, in the governments, academics, experts, students. So the audience which is now listening to us is like that. Let me introduce our discussion in the following terms. We are dealing with a unique kind of crisis. It started as a crisis of public health. It became a high level crisis in social, economic terms. We are confronted with the risk of a large scope recession, with the real risk of a downward spiral, which must be stopped somehow. So we are still in the emergency and anti-shock phase, saving lives, saving jobs, saving companies. But we know that we need also to prepare, and we are preparing the next phase, which is about recovery, relaunching the economy. But we also have an ambition is to use this recovery as a big plan for transforming our economies in line with European Green Deal and making the best of the digital revolution. So we can say that this is perhaps the highest test ever to the process of European integration. And we know that we need to invent something new. We need to invent a new agenda based on stronger instruments. And this is now the big moment where some decisions can be taken, particularly on the role of the budgetary capacity in the European Union. What should be the priorities? How can we finance these? What is the relationship between finance these and the need of moving in the European taxation? These are some of the issues we'd like to discuss today. So let me introduce right now the first round of discussion with our three high-level speakers by putting things in these terms. When dealing with this crisis and taking into account that we have at least these three phases: anti-shock, recovery, transformation. Do you think that the moment has come for a kind of paradigm shift in the economic policy making? What are your views about this? So we'll start with João Stiglitz, our guest from the other side of the Atlantic, but someone who knows very well about European choices. And Joseph, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I think it is an opportunity for paradigm shift, but it's also an interesting opportunity because there has been no event that could illustrate the importance of the principles, values, ideals of the progressive movement than this pandemic. The pandemic makes it clear that the market can't solve this problem. You need a balance between market, government, civil society, comprehensive response. It would require, it requires a response that entails notions of social justice and equality. It requires, it emphasizes how important investments are. It highlights the importance of science, transparency, democratic values, all the things that the progressive movement has stood for. In a way, coming from across the Atlantic, you are seeing in the United States the antithesis of all these things and what happens. And that's why in many ways I see this as a moment of a paradigm shift, because you're seeing in very stark form what happens when you deny these basic principles. So let me just give you some examples. The United States, the conservative movement said the markets could solve all problems. We saw very clearly in the United States, the markets couldn't even produce masks, couldn't even produce supply the tests, the protective gear that people needed. We had massive shortages, and months after the crisis was clear, the markets were unable on their own to respond. 40 years of denigrating the role of government. We've seen the consequences. The government wasn't able to respond. President Obama had recognized this risk and set up in the White House an Office of Pandemics. President Trump had taken it away. Rather than strengthening the ability to manage risk and the use of science in managing risk, President Trump had defunded the Centers for Disease Control, the agency responsible for helping us manage through this, and defunded science throughout the government, made fun, denigrated the role of expertise in solving what is clearly a very big problem of the kind that we've never had before. It's precisely because there wasn't the deep thought about how to respond in any of the areas that you talked about, that while the United States has spent trillions of dollars, $3 trillion by the federal government and trillions, probably even more by the Federal Reserve, unemployment in the United States has soared. The full unemployment rate probably now is at the level comparable to the Great Depression. So the money hasn't been very effective. It hasn't reached the most vulnerable because there wasn't thought about how to do that, and it wasn't a priority for the administration. And most disturbing, and this is where I want to link where Europe is going and the difference, I hope, there was no vision as we used a fire hose to spray money around the economy, these trillions of dollars. No vision of what kind of a society, not what kind of economy we wanted to see emerging on the other side. Well, we know we want to move to a knowledge economy, and yet our knowledge institutions got almost no money. We know that one of the reasons why the disease, COVID-19, has actually such a devastating effect on the United States is because we have, this is not an equal opportunity disease that goes after those with poor health conditions. And our health delivery system, in spite of spending so much money, doesn't work very effectively. But the Democrats had to fight to get money to our hospitals. And even then, it didn't go necessarily to the hospitals that needed it. It went to those that were most best connected. So what we've seen, and take climate change, which we know is an issue that we have to deal with as a next risk down the line, hasn't gone away as we faced the pandemic. Money went to some of the sectors of our economy with the biggest carbon footprint without putting any conditions on them that they cut back on their carbon footprint. So what this moment has highlighted is the very importance of our working together, of solidarity. It's like a war, and we've had to come together to fight the war. It illustrates the importance of externalities, where what one person does affects others. You can't solve this problem alone. It emphasizes the need for collective action. It emphasizes the need for expertise and deep thinking and thinking about our vision, about investment. So it's changed the priorities, or it should change all of these. The worry I have in the United States is that we're continuing to go through a culture wars, a kind of polarization. My hope is that enough Americans will see what all this implies, that there will be a paradigm shift. I think it's really important for Europe to lead the way at this particular moment and showing that one can address these problems in a democratic way, and on the basis of addressing the pandemic, use this to restructure the economy in ways that serves our society better than the economy that we had before the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this very strong statement on the situation about United States, and also clear message that can be expected from Europe. Well, in fact, we can say that this time Europeans are not positively impressed about what is coming from the United States, to say the least. Even if we could take inspiration from American experience back in the past, we are making some parallels about Roosevelt's inspiration, or even Hamilton moment. So let me now pass the floor to Nadia CALVIñO. And here we are. So is this a moment for a paradigm shift in economic policy? Dear Nadia, so the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. 3 brief reactions to what Joe said. And it's a pleasure to see you again, although this time we're not able to be together in the same, in such exceptional environment. Last time we met, we were in the Vatican. So actually it was
Yes.
quite an outstanding environment, you know, for these kind of discussions. Now, 3 reactions. First, I couldn't agree more that this is a crisis which is forcing us to go back to basics, and is questioning some of the prejudices that have been developing over the last decades. So we have discovered, and at least this is very clear in Spain, and which is suffering very directly the pandemic, we have rediscovered that actually we need food, and having a very strong farming sector and good distribution is absolutely essential if we want to keep everybody fed and calm, you know, and go through this kind of crisis in the best possible manner. That we need health, that we need strategic supplies of some goods, which indeed the market is not able to provide on a 24-hour notice if we don't have appropriate safety measures. So this is, I think, forcing all of us to go back to basics and going back to what the public sector is supposed to be providing for all of us, which means strengthening our welfare states, our public health systems, public and private cooperation, reinforcing safety nets for workers and businesses. So I think that the progressive agenda is definitely the winning one, and the one which the whole of our societies are embracing. At least that's what we see around us. They expect the public sector to protect them and to provide them with all these public goods. So that's my first reflection. The second one is, does this lead to a paradigm shift? And I think this paradigm shift had already taken place in the following sense. In the last years, we have seen a growing consensus coming from some quarters which were not really defending this kind of language, like the IMF, like some other international organizations, that we really needed to move towards a model of inclusive, sustainable growth. You know, so beyond the numbers and the traditional cold indicators, we were growingly concerned and aware of the need to think about inclusiveness, think about sustainability. So I think the paradigm shift was already taking place. I think that this crisis is accelerating underlying trends which were already there, because we have maybe a feeling that due to the economic crisis which is ensuing and which is going to hit us and is already hitting us, but is going to hit us very deeply in the course of this year. If we don't act now, then maybe we're missing the last unique opportunity to actually face these challenges, which are not going away. You know, climate change, the need to develop a knowledge economy, digitalization, how to ensure that this is a humanistic and human-driven process, how to deal with the robotization and the new trends in the labor market. You know, all these issues are very serious challenges that we have to face, and there is, I think, a growing urgency and a feeling of we need to do it now. You know, we cannot lose a day because maybe we're missing this unique last chance. And my third and final reflection has to do with intergenerational fairness. We are going to have to increase our deficits and our debts very significantly. This is a generalized movement throughout our countries. I mean, the US is obviously an extreme example, but throughout Europe, we're all having to face, and there is no alternative. We have to increase our debt levels, which is a burden for future generations. So we better do our utmost so that we leave a better world for them. You know, we have to invest in their future if we want to be fair to the different generations, and not again miss this unique opportunity, a challenge, but also an opportunity we shouldn't miss. Those would be my three initial reactions to Joe's very insightful comments. Thank you.
Nadia, many thanks. This is also a strong source of inspiration coming from you, because you are just identifying big trends for the future, and you are right. So this is also an opportunity for us to come up with a bolder transformational agenda. Let's listen now to Paolo Gentiloni. What are your thoughts about this? How far are we going in a kind of paradigm shift?
Yes, thank you, Maria, and good morning, good afternoon to Nadia, Professor Stiglitz, and all of you. Definitely, I think that we both face dangers, and we have a great opportunity for this paradigm shift. We are, in fact, at a crossroad where both tendencies are there, and it depends on us also, on us, where will we be able to go, at least in Europe, because dangers of an evolution for worse are not impossible. Obviously, we can have social damages producing social tensions, differences among areas of Europe, differences, internal differences in countries, even among generations, differences that are emerging in some way in these complicated weeks. And then we have more international or global risks, on trade, protectionism, tendencies of a new Cold War, etc. Risks and opportunities. I am frankly, on the optimistic side. Maybe it's the optimism of the will, as Antonio Gramsci famously said, but I think we have to stress the opportunities. First of all, the problem of what consequences the fact that we will have a stronger role for government and for the public in economy, what consequences this will have. I think we are able to avoid negative consequences, despite the fact that we can't ignore in Europe also a certain degree of appeal of these potential negative consequences. I mean, the idea that a stronger role of the state and the government is in a certain sense bringing to an attraction for authoritarian capitalism models. I am not referring only to external models in countries like China or Russia, but I'm referring also to internal problems that we have in Europe, of this approach of a stronger role of the government and of the state after this pandemic, translated in a attraction for authoritarian model. But overall, I think that the potentiality for good of this bigger role of government and of public presence in the economy is very strong, the case for good. Because in fact, in these weeks, we experienced the effectiveness of some features of our European welfare state model, with all its problems and weakness, but for sure the public healthcare system open to everybody, for sure transparency, the role of science, as Professor Stiglitz was reminding, the capacity of the European model to at least reduce the damage for jobs, for employment in a crisis like the one we are experiencing with our systems of protection of jobs. So the basis, I think, for defending this model is there. The problem is if we will be able not only to defend the quality with all their weakness of this model, but also to adjust it, to change it in some way, and to use this big crisis and the enormous amount of resources that will be spent at national and European level to reorient this model towards sustainability. This, I think, is the key word, both social sustainability and environmental sustainability, together with the transition to the knowledge society and innovation, are opportunity for now. They are not easy because we will also face part of our public opinion, especially on the European Green Deal, supporting the idea that this is not something for now, that now we should recover and restart our economies, and then the time will come for going back to the Green Deal. And I think we should be very, very clear that it is exactly the contrary, because it is now or never. Either we use this opportunity of this big effort to restart our economies, to reorient them on the right track of sustainability, or we will not be able to do this later. In conclusion, I think we have a very large opportunity. Populist nationalism is not stronger now than it was 6 months ago in Europe. It is weaker. And it is surprising because, in theory, such a crisis could have strengthened political positions supporting the strong man and this kind of nationalism. But it is not the case, because the first reaction was a reaction stressing the importance of the principle of community in our societies, and even of the necessity of multilateralism and cooperation at global level. But will we be able to confirm and strengthen this opportunity, and so to use next months to support this, to fight against solitude in our societies, to fight against selfishness and nationalism at international level? I think we have a strong opportunity. So sustainability, multilateralism, fighting solitude, and the transition to a modern society is something that we should have clear in mind in these months where we spend a lot of money to try to repair the damages of this crisis. But repairing is not sufficient.
Thank you very much, Paolo. You are so clear on this need of facing the crisis also with a strong sense of opportunity. It is there. And I think in this first round, we could see the three speakers endorsing this idea that the crisis is big, but it's also bringing a very unique opportunity to come up with a real transformative agenda. Now, Paolo has also put the finger on something very important, I believe, which is the differences between member states. Because we cannot say that all member states are in the same conditions to push for this strong recovery with strong transformation. And this is a central issue of the European situation. And over the last months, weeks, it was possible already to agree on a relevant package of coordinated action. So everybody knows the package, action from the ECB, and then the measures adopted and prepared by Eurogroup with EIB and the SURE and the way to use the European Stability Mechanism. But everybody also knows that this package will not be enough. And we need to invent something bigger. And that's why you have this discussion on complementing the European budget with a recovery fund. So at the heart of the matter, if you want to cope with the situation, we need to strengthen our budgetary capacity for the European Union as a whole, and also for the Eurozone. So I'm not asking you, of course, to unveil the decisions which will be taken tomorrow by the Commission's College. This is to ask too much. Nevertheless, my question is, can we say that finally in Europe, we can build up the big bazooka we need to have to cope with such a crisis? So I would like to ask again Joe to start with, and then followed by Nadia and Paolo. Please, Joe. You know about big bazookas.
Yeah, well, it's very clear you need a big bazooka to deal with this enormous crisis and to see your way through it. Maybe I should begin by just highlighting how important it is, not just for Europe, but for the entire world, that things work well in Europe and that the progressive agenda prevails in Europe, and that a democratic demonstration of a democratic response is absolutely vital with the growth of authoritarianism in so many countries. So it is not just in Europe's interest, it's really in the world's interest that you be successful. I think that the current framework is obviously not adequate to dealing with the problem. And there is one thing or two things that need to be done. In the short run, what needs to be done is Eurobonds. There has to be some way of raising money in the short run with the collective borrowing power of all of the EU. Without that, there will simply not be enough of a bazooka to address what is needed. I think it has to be larger than a lot of the numbers that I've seen. And that's true even if it's reasonably well targeted. And this is especially true because the individual countries themselves, some of the countries most affected by it, simply don't have the resources. Over the longer run, I think there has to be an agreement to move towards more European taxation, corporate taxes, wealth taxes at the very a digital tax. There are a number, a carbon tax. There are a number of taxes, financial transaction tax. There are a lot of taxes that would actually make Europe function better as a society, as an economy, and which would generate revenues that would enable Europe to collectively address some common problems. And let me just finally say, Europe is not going to have a strong recovery if large parts of Europe are not having a strong recovery. You're all in there together, and that's why it makes a lot of sense for Europe as a collective to provide the support for all the members, not just through loans, but through grants, financed through common borrowing and common taxation.
Thank you very much, Joe. A very clear message about what is really needed in Europe. And let's listen to Nadia now as a unique experience as Spanish Minister of Finance also. Nadia, what can you tell us about this? And yeah, Spain is so really a pioneer in coming with new ideas.
Thank you. No, I very much what Joe has just said, and of course what Paolo said before, I found extremely inspiring. Fighting solitude is something so strong in these very specific crises. 3 or 4 points to not to repeat what Joe has just said. First, about the magnitude of what we're discussing. I mean, at the national level, we estimate the measures that we have undertaken to amount, the discretionary measures to amount to around 3% of GDP, plus automatic stabilizer around 4% of GDP, plus liquidity measures through public guarantees up to 10% of GDP. This is a very important effort. A very important fiscal effort, and despite the fact that it may not be as big as in other countries, this is a very important effort. We're focusing very much our effort in short-term work schemes, so protecting jobs, self-employed workers, which are the most vulnerable part of our societies and our economic tissue, and liquidity provision so that the companies do not have to close, those companies that were viable before the crisis broke. These measures are proving to be very effective. We see that they are dampening, that they're stopping the very negative impact that this crisis could have had, in particular on unemployment. But this is a very big effort at the national level, which we obviously cannot undertake alone. Second point is I think it's very positive that we have been able to reach agreements on short-term liquidity provision at the EU level. This week, we have reached an agreement on the EIB to provide up to 200 billion in loans, mainly to SMEs throughout Europe. This is important from a level playing field point of view, also that all companies in Europe are able to access the EIB money and the good financial conditions. Today, we have adopted in the Spanish government's meeting the decision to provide the public guarantees which are needed for the SURE instrument to be launched as soon as possible, so that we have this embryo of a unemployment reinsurance system at the EU level, something which is very dear to us. And you know, we've been fighting for this from day one. And I think this is very important politically. And then it's also very good that the ESM is going to provide us with a precautionary, all countries with a precautionary credit line that all countries can draw into. These are 3 European institutions. 2 of them are EU, 1 is Eurozone, and they will issue European debt. So we cannot underestimate the importance of what has been achieved and what is providing a very fast response, very different to what happened in the previous financial crisis. And I think we should all put this, you know, into value and see this as an important taboo breaking kind of step forward. Thirdly, is this enough? I don't think so. I think that we need to definitely invest in order to accelerate the economic recovery and also to reorient it towards the elements that we have mentioned in the previous question. Just looking at the autumn and spring Commission's forecast, I wouldn't like to, I mean, Paolo may correct me, I think that just looking at the 2 numbers, one would estimate 750 billion as the minimum output loss that we would have to compensate if we were just to look at the 2 forecasts. So we need an investment effort which is commensurate with the reconstruction needs if we want to have a robust economy recovery. And obviously we need to design this in a manner which reaches all citizens and is directed towards those countries which are being most affected by the health crisis and by the economic and social crisis. In this sense, and Maria Jose was referring to the fact that we did put a proposal on the table, which was based on debt issued by the European Commission, and then as a basis for grants to member states. I hope, let's see what the Commission proposes tomorrow. We saw a Franco-German paper only some days ago, which was a very positive news because it was going in this direction, very much aligned with what we have been defending. And I really hope that for once we do not do too little too late, but rather we are acting in a quite agile manner. And I hope we will be up to the level which is needed to face the challenge of a fast recovery, which reaches all countries in the Union, because I couldn't agree more. And I close with this. I think that we are as rich as the poorest in the Union, and we have to make sure that we all are moving in the same direction. The interconnectedness of our economies and our production lines is obvious. It makes it obvious that we need to look at our neighbors and be sure that they get out as fast as possible if we want to have a demand and an output recovering in Europe to the benefit of European citizens and also to the benefit of the whole of the world. You know, it's nice to hear that we are still important, you know, when it comes to the world economy. Thank you.
Nadia, many thanks. Can I just ask you to complete your reasoning, because this was very comprehensive, but there is a point where I think it's very important also to listen to your choice, is how far do you think that the level playing field for the single market is also confronted with new risks?
Yes, I have. This is a point that I have made in each and every one of our international European meetings. I am indeed quite concerned that if we do not provide for mechanisms to ensure this level playing field, to make sure that all companies in the EU are subject to the same kind of economic support and the same kind of rules, we end up with a very uneven economic recovery. When one looks at the volume of aid which is being provided in some countries, which cannot be matched by other member states, there is a clear risk. And I know the European Commission is very well aware of this and is trying to do their utmost. We are in close contact with other member states. We are also worried about these. We are in an exceptional time, an exceptional moment. Everybody understands we need to do exceptional, take exceptional decisions, but we need to make sure that we also have European level instruments in order to prevent, that this damage to the level playing field is more structural and goes beyond what is indispensable to fight the crisis.
Thank you very much. That is very clear. So, Paolo Gentiloni, what are your thoughts about all this?
Well, do we have a bazooka? My answer is we are making progress, as Nadia very clearly said, but a lot have still to be there to reach some general goals, the one that Joseph Stiglitz frequently writes and mentioned before. We are not in Berlin, but we were supposed to be there. So let me quote something that a few hours ago was said by Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German president, after a call with the Italian president of the Republic. Steinmeier said, in these weeks, we felt new awareness of a European common destiny. I think that this is possibly true, and that this is a basis, this awareness to go further towards the bazooka, so to say. Because what is happening, what Nadia described, is practically the fact that the extraordinary situation, the extraordinary crisis we experienced and we are experiencing and we will experience in the next months is putting in place for the first time some elements of common tools of fiscal policy at EU level. I repeat, some tools of fiscal policy. We know that the architecture of the Union is an architecture where we have a monetary policy for Euro area member states, and we have on fiscal policy only a mechanism of coordination / surveillance with some experiences not so positive in the crisis, the previous crisis, the crisis of 10 years ago. And since a certain time, 2 or 3 years, Mario Draghi before and Christine Lagarde now are frequently stressing the fact that we can't address the problems of divergence and fragmentation among member states and areas of the Union only with the monetary policy. and so advocating the importance of having a common fiscal policy. The extraordinary times we are living created, I think, a completely unprecedented chance to build some common tools, and some of them are already in place. The mechanism that Nadia reminded us, this so-called SURE, is something where the European Commission borrow in the markets to lend to member states to support their short-time work schemes. And it is something that was asked by progressive governments and personalities in the last 10 years. And it was practically done in 2 weeks in this crisis. And then, of course, we will have tomorrow this package of recovery in the Commission that will be, in any case, a further step in this direction, because again, the Commission will go to the markets and borrow to lend and to spend for common goals. So this is not, I think, something without consequences. I perfectly know that it is connected to the extraordinary situation. I know that all our measures will be presented as temporary and connected to this special situation. But I also know that for the first time after 10 years of a discussion between practically two very different positions, the supporters of risk prevention and the supporters of risk sharing, we have now a common ground which is not related to the accumulated debt of the past, but at least is related to the common and shared goals of that we have to face now and for the near future. And I am sure that these measures, despite the fact that they are temporary, will leave a sign. This is the history of the evolution of the European project. You have a crisis, you react in a certain way, and the flavor of the solution that you find remains in the European architecture. And I'm sure that it will remain. It's up to us to build on this.
Thank you very much, Paolo. You are very clear. Yes, we are inventing something new in our toolbox. Now, let me use the last minutes we have, so the third round among yourselves, with two very precise questions. One is the following. There is now a very clear idea on the need of counting on a stronger European budget, able to provide more European cohesion, and also to finance the priorities for the future. On this, we have a kind of common ground. Now, the problem is, how should these be translated into practical terms? Should be these based mainly on loans, or should also count on grants when translating these new budgetary capacity on the ground, using the upcoming recovery fund? This is the first question. Second question, There is now an important move on the way to finance this new recovery fund by issuing a certain kind of euro bonds turned to the future, as Paolo was saying. But a question remains, and how should we back this issuance of bonds? Should this be backed on national guarantees, or do you need definitely European guarantees on resources? And in this case, what should be the new own resources? What should be the new kinds of European taxation we should push for? Let me tell you that now we have less time than in the previous rounds. Please confine yourselves to 2 minutes maximum. And we start again with Joe, please.
Well, I'll be very brief because I've answered some of that before. You need to have grants, not just loans. Many of the countries have already too much debt to easily manage. There is really a need for European solidarity, and that has to take the form of grants. On the second thing is the backing needs to be with European resources through taxes. And I listed before a whole set of taxes, from environmental taxes, financial transaction, wealth taxes, digital tax, corporate tax. There are arguments for why each of these would be better done at the European level rather than at different national levels. So I think there's a compelling argument, even for European integration, why this ought to be taxed at the level of the EU. Finally, let me say, I think an idea that ought to be discussed a little bit more is the use of perpetuities as the way of providing the finance, because it will put less burden on the immediate future. And finally, let me just say, the idea that Nadia raised about the issue of intergenerational equity is a really important issue. And that really reinforces why the money, at least some of the money, has to be for the economy of the future, the Green Deal and the knowledge economy that will enable Europe to have a higher standard of living going forward.
Yes, and Nadia, what are your thoughts about this?
Two points. First of all, if we want all countries to come out stronger, it cannot be that the recovery is funded through more debt at the national level. So some countries already have very high debt to GDP ratios. We are expecting Spain to go up to 115%, which is relatively, it's not amongst the highest in Europe, but it is higher than we would have wanted, obviously, and we had made a very big effort to go down in the last year. So I don't think that the solution can be more debt at national level, and that is why from the beginning we have very strongly argued for European debt, a European response funded by European debt and based on I wouldn't say would get out of this borrow to lend or borrow to spend. I think we have to borrow to invest together, and because we're investing in our future. And so I think that's more of the approach that we should have from this investment plan. This is not just expenditure, this is investment in our future. So the priorities you have mentioned, very well, we're fully aligned, I think, with the European agenda of Green New Deal and digitalization, etc. My second point is that definitely we have to think about reinforcing our revenue side on two fronts. One is at the EU level. I think we have to accelerate work on a digital tax. Of course, a global minimum corporate tax, green taxes. There are a number of areas have been explored, but we haven't been able to close a deal yet. The FTT is another example. We're going to proceed at national level with the digital tax and the FTT. So I absolutely think this is something that we need to make fast progress with. And on the second front is real tax harmonization. Having forum shopping and profit shifting between member states is like is a big hole in our economic union. And if we want to really reinforce, as Paolo was saying before, the second leg of the monetary union, and we need to reinforce our fiscal union, we have to start with having minimum corporate tax levels and stopping this situation, which is detracting revenues from all of our public systems, which need this money to fund the necessary investments for the future.
Yeah, many thanks, Nadia, extremely clear. And let's listen now to Paolo, please.
Yes, well, I think that President von der Leyen frequently repeated that this recovery strategy fund plans should be based both on grants and on loans. And I think this will be the case. On the taxation issue, what here we, in the Brussels language, we call also own resources. I think we have an incredible number of possible way to proceed, not to explore, but to proceed. But we are also aware of difficulties. You all know that decisions on taxation are in our system taken at unanimity, de facto unanimity, because exceptions are very difficult and controversial. And you also probably know that the proposals of the Commission 2 or 3 years ago, both of a digital taxation and of a minimal corporate taxation at EU level, were not able to be to reach this unanimity in the Council. But having said this, I am convinced that for these two big issues, but also for several instruments connected to the green transition, there is now a stronger case to reach result. The stronger case is the crisis that we have. The stronger case is the fact that the Commission will issue debt in the market. And I am pretty confident on the fact that the next European presidency, Germany, will be very active in this sense, because Minister Olaf Scholz, I think, is very much convinced of the importance to try to have important step further in this issue. So I am quite optimistic that maybe we can reach results despite this unanimity rule.
Thank you very much, Paolo. You were also very clear in sending a very clear message to the upcoming German presidency. So let's keep in mind this is a video conference taking place in Berlin. And that's why now we should also listen to the large audience, which is a bit everywhere in Europe. And David Rinaldi, I hand over to you to tell us which are the questions you will pick from the many you are receiving from the audience. What can you tell us?
Yes, we have received a big amount of questions from the different means of communications that we are using today. Some of which you have already responded during your different interventions, but two perhaps remain still to be touched. One refers more specifically to the role of the European Central Bank and of monetary policy, which has been changed rather fast, but on a very temporary way. And I try to condense here different questions from Andrew, Apostolos, Paolo Meucci. How do you see the changing role of monetary policy in Europe that at the moment has remained rather somehow has not been a paradigm change, because the paradigm apparently ends with December, and also because the German Federal Constitutional Court has something to say about the programs of the European Central Bank. The other point is instead on the inequalities that are bound to increase on different aspects as a consequence of the pandemics. You have mentioned the intergenerational inequalities. Some of our attendees, Christian Morabito, Rainer, Paula, they are mentioning instead the divide and the increasing inequalities in terms of the rural divide, educational loss, particularly for the children, the expected high-level youth unemployment, and they are wondering how an SDG-inspired policymaking could make the difference in Europe, perhaps through the European semester, and how we could go back to a sort of economy of well-being, and what it would mean for you to prioritize well-being and the fight against inequality.
Very well. So I think it was a very good pick. I would now invite our guests to comment these questions. Let me just make a short rephrasing the questions. One is about the role of monetary policy, and having in mind that ECB role was recently challenged by the Karlsruhe in Germany. The question is, how far must we count on monetary policy, and how far we are now also reaching a moment where fiscal policy needs to come in to cope with the scope of the crisis. The second question is, in fact, about intergenerational fairness, big concern. But let me also invite you to comment on the following problem. Knowing that youth unemployment is rising again sharply, which are the new sources of job creation we need to push for, particularly using the Green Deal or the digital transition, helping young people to go to this new way of our economies to work. So these are two questions. You can pick as you wish. And let's start now with Nadia, then João, and then again Gentiloni.
Thank you. Yes, very, very broad issues and very relevant. I do think that the ECB is playing a very important role right now in terms of stabilization of debt markets. And it is providing the role it should play in a monetary union, ensuring that we can undertake the very difficult decisions that need to be taken in these circumstances in a context of relative stability. So I think it is, you know, we should value it. I don't know if it's a paradigm shift, but definitely it has acted in a very decisive manner and in a very fast and effective manner. And I think it is very important. It shows that we do have a very good instrument there. And I think that what we're lacking is the other leg, the fiscal leg, which indeed is what we are discussing going forward. Second reflection on inequality more generally. As I said in my first reaction, it is noteworthy how the different institutions have been looking at inequality and inclusive growth as part of their the elements for growth to be sustainable. Now, this social sustainability is at the core of the recommendations. Only last week we got a recommendation from the European Commission, which had to do indeed with inclusion of the young, preventing low quality jobs, protecting the weaker workers, and also reorganizing and making more effective our social redistribution instrument, which are quite weak in Spain. And actually this week we will be adopting a very important decision to establish a minimum income system, which is going to revamp existing subsidies with a clear target of removing extreme poverty and fighting child poverty. So but this has been recommended by the European Commission. I have to say, this shows, how different the approach is compared to what may have been the case years ago, when probably we were not so aware that, or not everybody was so aware that income distribution is part of a healthy growth and sustainable growth and a socially sustainable growth in our society. So I think that there is an increased focus on reducing inequality, and rightly so, I think. And the young are the ones that are most affected. They were the most affected by the previous financial crisis, and now they are the most affected because they have these more vulnerable jobs. And we need to provide all sorts of mechanisms to protect, to avoid, in the case of Spain, this is very clear, to avoid the temporary workers are the automatic adjustment factor in our economies. That is why I think it's so important that this time we have been using these newly created short-term work schemes with strong public support. But what it has done for the moment already in these 2 months is that the drop in employment is much smaller than the drop in GDP. Whereas in the previous crisis, the 2008-2009 crisis, it was a smaller drop in GDP and a huge drop in employment. So we see that we have internal mechanisms of flexibility and adjustment, which, if they are appropriately supported, and of course talking about a short crisis, are a much better instruments than having always the most vulnerable workers, those with temporary contracts, being the adjustment factor in our societies. I think that moving towards European instruments to support this kind of short-term work schemes and reinsurance, a backstop for the people, after creating so many backstops for the banks for years, it's very good that now we're focusing on backstops for the people, and this is clearly, in my view, the direction we should continue on in the coming months.
Yeah, many thanks, Nadia, for a very precise explanation. Yes, a backstop for the people. You are so clear, and the SURE instrument is a very good move in this direction. Now let's listen to Joe again. Your comments.
Good.
On
So
these.
I couldn't agree more with Nadia. I think she's absolutely right. Let me make just a few brief remarks. First, I think monetary policy is very important, but is very limited in this context. The real problem is if there are long periods in which enterprises, for instance, can't do business, the revenues, they face a solvency problem, not a liquidity problem. The banks, the ECB can address the problem of illiquidity, but it can't address the problem of insolvency. It can't address the problems of making sure that there are jobs. And so I think we have to, both in the United States and in Europe, focus mostly on fiscal policy. The second point on the inequalities, there are so many aspects of this I think that are really important. The data for the United States shows very clearly that the impact of this economic impact, as well as the health impact of COVID-19, is disproportionately among the poor. Europe has protected the poor better with its welfare system, and it's really something you should celebrate, your welfare state. But the more is needed, and along some of the lines that Nadia talked about, I've been particularly concerned about the very young and the people entering the labor force right now, most of whom will find it difficult getting jobs. So along that lines, I think it's particularly important to try to strengthen programs designed to focus education on those who are from poor backgrounds. Important to make sure that every high school, college graduate is either on a job in education or in some kind of training program, so these are not wasted years. One of the interesting questions that I thought had to do with the role of metrics in guiding decision-making. As many of you know, I was involved both on Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress and an OECD panel on the subject. And one of the things that's very clear is how important metrics are in guiding policy. One of the most successful countries in dealing with the pandemic has been New Zealand. And they're part of what is called the Wellbeing Alliance. And they've introduced into their budgeting process well-being, an explicit way of trying to account for the impact on individuals, people, particularly children, of all the measures, all the budgetary measures that they are undertaking. So I think this may be a moment where introducing more comprehensively that kind of broader metrics into our thinking will help shape policy in ways that really do reflect the progressive agenda.
Thank you very much, Joe. Probably we'll come back to this, but I was informed now that Paolo Gentiloni needs to leave. Paolo, do you still have 1 minute to conclude from your side?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Well, I think that the ECB is giving a strong, it's an understatement to say strong, a very strong contribution to financial stability in this period, and its independence. It's a pillar of our architecture, European architecture. So its monetary policy, its independence will continue undeterred, as Christine Lagarde repeated 2 or 3 times in these weeks. On the issue of inequalities, the jobs, I fully agree with Nadia and with Joseph Stiglitz, especially on the fact that the strength of our European system, the fact that it is able in these difficult moments to at least protect parts of the workforce and reduce the unemployment rate surge. And this is what Nadia was describing, the difference on the negative growth. And yes, unemployment is rising, but not at the same level. But we have 2 problems. One is that if we calculate the amount of hours worked, we see that there is a fall in the hours worked, very, very high, and this is also a decrease in household incomes. But then I fully agree with Nadia that the risk is that part of jobs, the more fragile, the younger are not fully protected by this kind of schemes. So, and here the issues of general form of protection comes up and is very, I think, very important. More in general, we are beginning to consider all the matter of the SDG goals as part of our fiscal policy coordination. So not only to have a social dimension, but also to have an environmental dimension and to focus on health, education, gender equality, and sustainability in general. I know that this approach has some criticism, typically saying, well, you are adding too many issues to this form of economic coordination policy. But I think that we have now cleared the dimension of the fact that we cannot only limit our surveillance and coordination role as a commission to the figures of deficit to GDP or debt to GDP. There are something in the treaties that we have to respect, but we have to coordinate our fiscal policies towards more ambitious goals. And for sure, this is our task. It's not saying that monetary policy is not important. Monetary policy is absolutely crucial and fundamental. But as Joseph Stiglitz said, solvency, for example, is a problem that we will try to focus and to face with the new package of the Commission, because this is something that we need to address too, and possibly to address it especially in sectors and countries weaker and not able to intervene directly with their own fiscal power. And this is the rebalancing role of the European Union, I think, in this field.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for your time on the eve of such an important meeting of the Commission. We wish you the best. Wish you the best, and many thanks for joining us.
Okay.
And
thank you, grazie.
Very well. All the best for your work. And let me just use the final minutes to come with a wide question to Joe Stiglitz, which is the following. So far, United States is not inspiring Europe. But if you go back in the history of the United States, we have other moments inspiring us. And one of these moments is Roosevelt New Deal. So my question for you is how far this parallel makes sense? This analogy makes sense or not from your viewpoint?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we've been discussing is what to do with the large number of young people who will have trouble getting jobs, the youth unemployment that may actually soar. And there are two approaches. One is, some people talk about a more extended universal basic income, give everybody income. And the other one is much more in the tradition of FDR. Let's have public works programs. Let's use this labor productively. You know, Europe is engaged in a very ambitious, but I think very necessary goal of the Green Deal. That's going to require lots of investment. You're transitioning to a knowledge economy. That's going to require a lot of investment. The question that was posed before is, does Europe have enough resources? Well, it makes no sense to say you don't have enough resources and then at the same time leave a large fraction of your most valuable resources, your human resources, idle. So the real point is, this is an opportunity to take some of this labor that would be just festering, not developing, not learning new skills, and direct it in the direction of what would be a 21st century European economy. So I think the sort of boldness that FDR brought to the American political scene after 4 years of stagnation is exactly what is needed at this moment. Europe and states have done some very bold things, and this is a moment for boldness in both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah. So many thanks for these brilliant comments. I provoke you on purpose, Joe, because this reference to President Roosevelt is really a big source of inspiration, hopefully for tomorrow, the Commission's meeting for the upcoming German presidency. And on this note, let me conclude, because we are reaching our time limit, in the following terms. I think these 3 rounds were, I think, brilliant for us to understand that this time, this crisis is so unique that we need to be at the level with, for sure, emergency measures, for sure, a big fiscal stimulus, big reliance on monetary policy also. But we need to use this crisis also as a unique opportunity to transform our societies and our economies in more fundamental ways. And climate change is there. The digital transformation is changing almost everything. And we need to have everybody in conditions to make the best of these transformations. So Europe has reached the high moment where we understood that monetary policy is important, but it's no longer enough. The big moment for stronger European budget has come, a budget to support the priorities of the future and also to ensure the economic and social cohesion. And for this, we need to be brave. And we need to invent an instrument, which is a budgetary one, providing not only loans, but grants. And this can only be based on issuance of Eurobonds backed by own resources, by new European taxes, and also counting on tax harmonization. I think our conclusions from today are clear. I'm very grateful to all our speakers. They were so precise and also so dense in their conclusions. And also big thanks to the audience, because you could follow. So this means that we could have a much larger audience than the one we could have if we would be physically in Berlin. This is one of the paradoxes of the current situation. And I'm very grateful to all the team behind us make this possible. And again, our big thanks on the behalf of our European Political Foundation to all these high-level speakers. And let's keep in touch for the next episodes, because something new and big and hopefully great is being invented for Europe and for the world. Many thanks. Thank you. Keep in touch. Bye-bye.